So we're continuing our study in the Gospel of John. So we started last week in John chapter 18, as we said before. Of course, John chapter 1 through 12 really deals with Tom mentioned to me that the sick family were here, but Hannah, the young daughter, got sick while she's here, so they taken her to the hospital. So let's go to God in prayer one more time, ask for her behalf. Let's pray. Father, we come again to you before your throne humbly, asking specifically for Hannah C. We pray that you would be with her, the illness that she has suddenly come upon her, that Father, you would be with her, that might be doctors and nurses that are looking after her might be able to determine what the cause and provide the necessary medications or means to eliminate this the illness. We pray, Father, that you'd be with the family as they still struggle with the loss of their son. We pray that you continue to be with them. It's in Jesus' name, amen. So, thank you, Tom, for mentioning that. They still are, I think, struggling quite greatly, as understandably so, as many people are. Gospel of John, in the first 12 chapters, we see Jesus' public ministry, and then chapters 13 through 17, more of his private ministry with his disciples. As we mentioned last week, chapter 18 and 19 really deals with the period of time when Jesus has been betrayed and he goes on trial. He has several trials, but John only depicts a couple of them. He is, of course, tried first with the high priest Annas, although Annas is not the high priest at this time. He had been for several years prior, along with his 5 sons, who had also been high priests. And then, of course, he goes to the trial from Annas to Caiaphas. Well, Caiaphas is the high priest in that year. He's the one that, you might remember in John chapter 11, this is better for one man to die for a nation. So he had prophesied of Jesus' death, which actually comes up in our discussions today. But John doesn't depict the trial with Caiaphas. Instead, he goes from Annas and makes a reference to the trial to Caiaphas. Of course, that's the trial when many witnesses came forward and could not agree upon the charges against Jesus. But from Caiaphas, he's sent to Pilate, which is the discussion of our today. We will have today from chapter 19 or 18, verse 28 through chapter 19, verse 26, is this extended trial in front of Pilate. Now, he's in front of Pilate, and what's interesting here is a couple things. One, the Jews do not enter the praetorium. Probably more likely, this is Caiaphas' home, his place of residence while he's in the area, which he also conducted business, an area which he would conduct business. We mentioned last week that the Roman governor or the Roman administrators would generally start very, very early in the morning, right at sunup, if not before, and would normally be worked his day through late morning, mid to late morning time frame, and that would be his administrative day. And this seems to be the case, and we'll see this as we discuss and move forward today. But in this trial, so it's about a 6-hour trial in front of Pilate, although some portion of this he sent to Herod Antipas, but Herod is not discussed in the Gospel of John, and then Herod brings him back, or they send him back to Pilate. And what Pilate is doing over and over, he's trying to wash his hands of this. He really wants nothing to do with this Jewish issue. But he seems to be, he is quite forced into getting involved and going against what he believes to be that Jesus is innocent. But 6 times or 3 times, Pilate comes out of the praetorium to speak to the Jews who did not come into the praetorium. And so each time he comes out, he presents a different continuing saga about the discussions he's had with Jesus. So as we look today, and hopefully we'll get through this trial, because it really needs to sort of come all together, and we can sort of see. But here's, of course, in this trial where Jesus reveals who he is, well, let's just read through it. Beginning in verse 28 of John chapter 18, let's just read through verse 32 at this point. Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas into the praetorium, and it was early, and they themselves did not enter the praetorium, so as they would not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. Therefore Pilate went out to them and said, "What accusations do you bring against this man?" And they answered and said to him, "If this man were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him to you." So Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him according to your law." The Jews said to him, "We are not permitted to put anyone to death." And to fulfill the word of Jesus, which he spoke, signifying by what kind of death he was about to die. David, do me a favor. Take my keys and in my truck in the console, or my reading glasses. Can you go get them for me, please? Thank you. So, as we mentioned, Jesus had been in trial before Annas. Annas sent him to Caiaphas, and now Caiaphas and the Jewish leadership then take him to the praetorium where Pilate is. And it says it was very early. We don't know the exact time. It is more probable that it was early in the morning, anywhere from 5 a.m. to 6 a.m. It would be, when you look at the Roman depiction of watches, times, the night watches, this could be anywhere between the third or the fourth watch. Third watch would be from midnight, well, we would say midnight to 3 a.m. 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. would be the fourth watch. They had names for those. But more than likely, this is towards the end of the fourth watch. They didn't have watches like you and I have. There were sundials, but they were far and few between. So they generally told time based on the location of the sun, the location of the stars, and these kind of things. So somewhere around early morning. Later on, it's going to say that, I forget what verse now, that they send Jesus over to be crucified, and it was the 6th hour. Well, that's about noon. So somewhere about 6 hours, this time continues or moves forward with Jesus in front of Pilate as well as in front of King Herod, which John doesn't discuss. But about 6 hours. Now, Jesus had been up the entire night. He was arrested sometime in the evening before, after darkness. And so at this time, these people are, he spent a long night having been questioned and beaten and spat upon and humiliated and abused. And now the same is about to occur in front of Pilate. So the Jews have done what they feel like they can do. We'll talk about that in a moment. But now it's early in the morning, and I only bring that up because it's a long night, and it's a very long morning. About 6 hours he's going to spend in this one trial between Pilate and King and Herod, back and forth. And it says, thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks. So they did not enter the praetorium so that they would not defile, but might eat of the Passover. How ironic it is that they are preparing for the Passover, and so they would not enter this Gentiles' palace or home, because that would be a defilement, which would prevent them from eating of the Passover. But yet, the Passover lamb is the one they are condemning. How ironic it is that they intended to be pure for the Passover, but yet they are condemning the very Passover lamb that they're celebrating. It's also ironic that they go to the Gentile ruler in order to accomplish what they desire, that is the killing and crucifixion of Jesus. They go to the Gentile ruler, but would not enter the Gentile's home. There's a lot of irony that's presented in this event. The fact that they wouldn't enter the Gentile home but yet they wanted the Gentiles to do their will, their mission to kill and crucify Jesus. The fact that Jesus is the Passover lamb, but they could not defile them. They didn't want to defile themselves when they were already defiled because they were condemning the Passover lamb. There's just a lot of irony here, and I just want to bring that out. But therefore Pilate, in verse 29, therefore Pilate went out to them and said to them, what accusation do you bring against this man? It's almost as if he doesn't really know, but we're going to read a little later. He has an idea of exactly what they want. In verse 30, it says, they answered and said to him, this man, if this man were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him to you. An evildoer would be someone who would be a danger to the public, someone who was causing problems and be a danger to those in that area. It's interesting that the charge against them is that this man was an evildoer. Well, it's such a general term. They did not specify specifically what charges they wanted to bring against this man. Why would that be? What charge did they really want to bring against Jesus? When Jesus stood before Annas, when he stood before Caiaphas, what was he being charged with? Blasphemy. Right, because he made himself out to be the Son of God. Right? That's going to come up a little later. But what charge did they tell Pilate? He's an evildoer. Just doing bad stuff. Right? They were very general. Why didn't they tell him what the actual charge is? Probably the very same reason that in Acts, I think it's Acts chapter 14, when the governor or procurator Galileo didn't want anything to do with the charges the Jews brought against Paul. It's a Jewish issue. Take care of your own religious issues. I want nothing to do with it. It's not a Roman issue. It's not. He claimed to be whoever he wants. It's not a Roman issue. And so they didn't specify the charge. Instead, they had expected and desired that Pilate would, in fact, sort of acquiesce or just fall in line to accept that this evildoer needed to be killed. I want to get to why they wanted him killed in this manner in a moment, but let me see if I'm close to that. So by the fact that they mentioned to him that he's an evildoer, sort of a tacit acknowledgement of their inability to bring a watertight charge against him, one that would justify crucifixion. And so they're sort of dancing around in order to get Pilate to achieve their mission, knowing that they don't really have a charge that justifies a Roman death of crucifixion. Now, does it justify the Jewish death, if it's true, blasphemy? Yes. By what means? Stoning. Not by crucifixion, right? Well, it's not so much to keep their hands clean. They want Jesus crucified.
He did that. We didn't do it. We didn't do anything.
Well, you're right in a sense. I think there's a sense that they don't want to take responsibility for this. And we're going to see that, they have no king but Caesar. But there's a specific reason that they want him crucified. They could have, by their own law, justified death through stoning. And we'll get to that in a moment. So Pilate said to them, take him, that's where I'm at now, take him yourselves and judge him according to your law. The Jews said to him, we're not permitted to put anyone to death. Were they permitted to put anyone to death by the law, the Jewish law? Answer is yes. Deuteronomy, I think it's 24. No, I didn't write that down. I thought I wrote, so yeah, Deuteronomy 21, verse 23. No, that's where one who's hung by a tree is cursed. I didn't write it down, but they were permitted to, I think it was Leviticus, somewhere in Leviticus. Yeah, I didn't write it down. So. anyway, they were permitted by their law to kill him, but that was through a means of stoning. They did later have other means of killing, but stoning was the one that generally was used. We saw Stephen in Acts chapter 7 was stoned. But by Roman law, Roman, especially when in the presence of the Roman governor or when he was present, the Romans would reserve the right of capital punishment. Capital punishment was intended to deter any insurrections or any of those who might want to cause issues for the Roman government. And so capital punishment by Romans, of course, as we know, is extremely severe in intent to deter any insurrections or any other, well, I'll just leave it insurrections. I can't think of another word. Somebody else might know it. But yet, the Jews wanted him crucified. Why would they want him crucified versus being stoned according to their law? What does it mean to be crucified? Hung on a tree. Warren?
That is a curse.
I can't hear you, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think in Scripture, man is cursed if he's hung on a tree.
Man is cursed if he's Deuteronomy, that's Deuteronomy 24. Man is cursed if he's hung on a tree. Exactly true. Why does that matter to them versus stoning?
Appropriate for the crime, basically.
Well, appropriate for the crime is stoning. But why do they want him crucified versus stoning? Vern?
Because he identified himself as the Son of God.
Well, that's the blasphemous, which justifies the stoning. But why did they want him crucified? Crucified is a curse on the tree, right? And Jesus' followers, they wanted to ensure that Jesus' followers were be dispersed and this was done. This would be over. Man is hung on a tree. He's cursed. God has cursed him. How can you follow a man that's cursed? This ensures in their mind that this issue is done. If they stoned him, there still might be followers believing that he was unjustly stoned. But he cursed, said, this issue's done. We won't have to deal with this ever again. Warren?
And Paul's right. Obviously, that was an obstacle to reaching the Jews and others because of that curse.
Sure.
So
Well, even today, Jesus Christ is our Lord, who's cursed on a tree. He's cursed on the cross. Such a cruel punishment intended for the worst of the worst, murderers and thieves and such. So how can we follow such a man? That was the thought process. It appears to be the thought process of the Jews at that time. Interesting, says it was done to fulfill the word of Jesus which he spoke, saying by what kind of death he was about to die. John chapter 3, verse 14. John chapter 3 and verse 14 speaks of, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so the Son of Man will be lifted up. Jesus himself prophesied of the death that he would do, that he would be died on a cross, that he would be lifted up, that is on the cross, as a double meaning, not only be lifted up on the cross, but as well as to be exalted and lifted up. John presents the cross as a victory. And so Jesus would be lifted up on the cross. His prophecy of his own death in such a manner shows that he's still in control. He's still sovereign, even though he's being tried. Verse 33, let's read 33 through 38. Therefore Pilate entered again into the praetorium and summoned Jesus and said to him, "Are you the King of Jews?" Jesus answered, "Are you saying this on your own initiative, or did others tell you about me?" Pilate answered, "I am not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests delivered you to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting so that I would not be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm." Therefore Pilate said to him, "You are a king. So you are a king." Jesus answered, you say correctly that I am king. For this I have been born, and for this I have come into the world to testify to truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. Excuse me. So Pilate, after he is speaking to the leadership of the Jews, initially he goes to Jesus to question him, and he asks him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" This points out immediately that he really understands what the issue is. The leadership of the Jews said he's an evildoer. And Pilate goes and talks to Jesus and says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Well, he knew all along what the issue was. He understood what the leadership was charging Jesus with. But this is not a charge that really affects him unless he's being king in a sense of insurrection. Were there kings of the Jews during the Roman days? Yes, King Herod was a king of the Jews. Unless Jesus is trying to become politically a king, Pilate doesn't care. This really is not his concern. I do want to mention a little bit about Pilate. It's somewhat important to understand his scenario here. During Pilate's tenure as governor of Judea, AD 26 to 36, during the Emperor Tiberius had placed him there. But he was placed there, according to Josephus in his writings of Galileo, he was placed there predominantly as a result of his sponsor, if I say his name right, Sejanus. Sejanus was the commander of the Praetorian Guard in Rome, and Sejanus had sponsored Pilate in the position that he's in. So Tiberius, commander of the Roman Praetorian Guard is a big position. And Tiberius listened to him, and he placed Pilate in the position he's at. And for a number of years, the early years of Pilate's tenure as governor of Judea was very, very cruel. If you have a sponsorship that's got your back, you can kind of get away with most anything. He didn't have to follow Roman law with non-Roman citizens. He could pretty much do what he wanted. Just keep the peace. And he did it in a very cruel fashion. First few years, he would put down any insurrection very quickly, very cruelly. He was very, he didn't like the Jews. He didn't really care anything about them. But the second half or period of his time as a tenure, Sejanus had been executed. And now his sponsor wasn't there anymore. And you could see, according to the writings of Josephus, there's a change in Pilate's attitude or his approach to the Jews who he despised. And we see that actually in this trial. In the past, it seems that Pilate would not have cared. He'd either dismissed Jesus completely, say, "Go away," or he would have just done what he wanted and never gone back. 3 times he goes back to the leadership of the Jews, trying to come to some agreement. For 3 different times, and he finally is persuaded or gives in to the Jews' demands, which would not have been the Pilate of old. But it seems that this time has changed how he interfaces with them because his sponsor is no longer there. That's just a little background information that in my mind was kind of neat. So he says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus answered, "Are you saying this on your own initiative, or did others tell you?" Excuse me, tell you about me. Well, Pilate answers him, "I am not a Jew, am I?" There's a degree of contentment he has against the Jews, a degree of contentment of having to even do this. It seems that more than just contentment, he just didn't feel like there was it's almost below him to have to deal with this issue. It just really, he didn't feel like he needed to deal with this issue. It just wasn't one of concern to him. And so he says, "I am not a Jew, am I? Your own nation, chief priest, delivered you to me. what have you done? What's the answer? What had he done? Nothing. Nothing at all. So Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would be fighting so that I would not be handed over to the Jews, but as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm. Therefore Pilate said to him, so you are a king. Jesus admits and affirms that he is a king, but his kingdom is not of this world. Pilate seems to recognize that to some degree, Jesus sees himself as a king, but he doesn't see it as a political threat. Because from henceforth he goes forward in front of the Jews and say, this is your king. He's your king. But he doesn't see him as a political threat. If he saw him as a political threat, there would have been no question. He would have definitely had him crucified immediately. He would never have gone back and forth to say that he is not guilty. He finds no fault in this man. Therefore Pilate says, so you are a king. And Jesus says correctly that I am a king. For this reason I have been born, or I have come into this world to testify the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. John chapter 3 and verse 31 through 36, I think brings this out nicely. John chapter 3, beginning verse 31, says, he who comes from above is above all. He who is of the earth is from the earth, and speaks of the earth. He who comes from heaven is above all. What he has seen and heard, of that he testifies, and no one receives his testimony. He who has received his testimony has set his seal to this, that is, God is true. For he whom God has sent speaks the words of God, for he gives the Spirit without measure. The Father loves the Son, and he has given all things into his hand. He who believes in the Son has eternal life, but he who does not obey the Son will not see life, but the wrath of God abides on him. Jesus Christ was sent, was born into this world to testify of the truth, to testify God, to testify of the Father, to be a witness, and that everyone who is of the truth, that is, that everyone who believes that Jesus is the Son of God, then hears his voice. Pilate then asked this question that we all heard many times: what is truth? I don't think he was really coming from a philosophical perspective, but more likely more from a political perspective, in the sense that, what really is truth? It's really what I want it to be. Isn't that the way the world is today? I mean, I don't care if you're talking about the religious world or the secular world. Too often, people determine what truth is based on their own standard, a standard that they develop or a standard that society gives them, versus the standard that God gives. That's what Jesus was speaking of. This is the standard of truth. I am the truth. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. I am the truth. I am the standard. My words are truth. Sanctify them in truth. Set them apart from the world in truth. But the world, secular or religious, will determine truth using a different standard, or judging God's words inappropriately as a standard. Inappropriately. The world today determines what is true and what is not true. We can look in society today and how people determine what's right and what's wrong, what's moral, what's immoral. Even if one doesn't believe in God, they may accept or may agree that it's immoral to kill. Well, that's a societal expectation. But the standard that God presents is the one that we provide and follow. But yet people in the world today want to define their own standard. They'll determine, well, it's okay, we agree it's not good to kill, but then you're going to define, well, it's okay to kill an unborn child. It's okay to kill someone who's at the end of their life. Society determines, or wants to determine, what's acceptable, and they make their own moral standard. And so when Pilate asked, what is truth? It's the same thing that the world says. What is truth? The answer is to them, whatever we want it to be. What truth for you is truth different for me. And that's what they say today. That's what he was saying. It's whatever I want it to be. And that's the way the world is today. Truth is God's word. It's his standard that we follow. And when we deviate from it, we have not truth. And when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said, here's the first time, or the second time, I find no guilt in him. He says this 3 times. But you have a custom that I release someone for you at the Passover. Do you wish then I release for your king of the Jews? So he's very, especially from henceforth, this sort of absurd nature that they would define him as a king. So he's actually thrown this back in their face, almost sarcastically. Here's your king. And so in verse 4 he says, they cried out again, not this man, but Barabbas. And Barabbas was a robber. Interesting that Luke chapter 23, verse 19, speaks of Barabbas as an insurrector, as a murderer. And if you look at the Greek words here versus in Luke 23, Barabbas was probably all of the above. He was a thief. He was one who was instigating trouble. He was probably a murderer, in which that was the result of his instigating trouble. That he was, so he was the one that was deserving of crucifixion by the Roman standard. And yet it was Jesus that was one going to be crucified. And of course, as we know, the Jews then didn't want Jesus to be released. So they cried out, not this man, but Barabbas. Barabbas was a robber. So in chapter 19, verse 1 through 5, Pilate then took Jesus and scourged him, and the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and put a purple robe on him. And they began to come up to him and to say, Hail, King of the Jews, and to give him slaps in the face. Pilate came out again and said to them, Behold, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no guilt in him. Again. Jesus then came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said to him, Behold the man. In verse 1 of chapter 19, it says he scourged him. Now this is the first scourging. You know, he had 2 scourgings, right? This is the first one. There was different levels of punishment that the Roman government would provide to a non-Roman citizen. If you're a Roman citizen, you would not be scourged. This scourging was one that probably used the leather straps, or even, you ever have a mom or your dad say, go out and get the switch, and go get me my switch? Something of this nature, maybe some poles that were bound together, of which they would beat them with, or leather straps that they would beat. They would typically leave welts. And if you beat them enough, the welts might bleed some, but not one that one would die from. One that would certainly hurt. You ever been hit by a switch, you know it hurts. It would leave a welt. So this was not intended to kill him. It was intended to humiliate him. It was intended to punish him. Not so much for his purpose, but for the Jews' purpose. So this is his first scourging. We're going to see in a moment the second scourging. So verse 19, chapter 19, verse 2, the soldiers twisted a crown together of thorns and put it on his head and put a purple robe on him. One or 2 different materials would have been used. A date palm, which at the bottom of the date palm is very thorny, and that could be peeled off and twisted together to make a crown like a crown. Or a common thorn bush that were in the area. And I've read, and we've all heard, I think, that these thorns can be as long as 12 inches long. I mean, 12 inches is about so. That's a pretty long thorn. I don't know if it was that long. I think we want to think the worst. It may not have been that long. But it was one that would definitely penetrate into the skull to the degree that would cause pain, would cause bleeding, and you would see blood running around his face and his back. Such. It was intended to, again, humiliate him, as well as when they put the purple robe on him. They came up to him, and the purple robe, purple is very expensive. It comes from a shellfish. Whether it was purple or red or some mixture of, it was probably a military cloak, which they put on him with the crown of thorns and then, of course, they want to humiliate him. If you've ever been with a bunch of guys, a lot of testosterone, and especially the Romans, who love to abuse and to love to humiliate in any way possible, that's who the Romans were. We've seen, or know of, many people know of, especially if you've been in areas where there are guys together who have separate from the rest of society, and they lose their sense of right and wrong or morals, and their testosterone can lead them to do very cruel things. One keeps building on top of the other. Well, anyway, the Romans can be very, very cruel. And we have a bunch of soldiers who have their will with him and are slapping him. And it's probably not just a slap like so, it's probably a very, at full force kind of slap in his face, spitting on him, mocking him. And all this is in order to humiliate him. And then they bring him back to Pilate, and Pilate takes him out again. Pilate says, verse 4, came out again and said to them, behold, I'm bringing him out to you, so that you may behold that I find no guilt in him. In other words, I have punished him severely to the extent that is necessary. There's really nothing wrong. This kind of punishment was intended to interrogate, and there's really no reason for me to go beyond this. Jesus then came out wearing the crown of thorns and purple robe, and Pilate said, behold the man. It is ironic in that he refers to him as the man. He is the God-sent Son of Man. He is the Son of Man in that he is God in flesh. He is God who has lived on this earth without sin. He is the Son of God who is dwelt among us. And so he is the man, the one that God had sent, the Son of Man. So when the chief priest in verse 6, let's go 6 through 11. The chief priest of the officers saw him, and they cried out, saying, crucify, crucify. Pilate said to him, take him yourself and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him. This is the verse I was looking for in Leviticus 24, verse 16. They say that, again, he finds no guilt in him. Verse 7, the Jews answered him and says, we have a law, and by the law he ought to die because he made himself out to be the Son of God. This is the issue that the underlying issue, as we mentioned, is the blasphemous in the sense that he made him out to be the Son of God, and so they wanted him crucified. Verse 8, therefore, when Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. The fear that Pilate has, it could be one or two things. It could be that many in the pagan world were very superstitious. They did believe that the gods came down to earth. Just think about in Acts, I think that's Acts 14, when Paul and Barnabas were revered as a god, as Jupiter and some other god, Mercury, I think it is. So they did believe that gods came down to earth and dwelt among us, and being referred to the Son of God, it could be very superstitious that he had concern in that regard, but in addition, it could more likely be that he was concerned that he was not winning over the Jews, and considering his political situation, his backer, his sponsor had been executed by this time frame. More likely his fear was more of political, his position of authority. The Jews had already been to Tiberius, the emperor, one time before this. A few years before, they'd been to Tiberius because of cruelty that Pilate had ruled over that area. And Pilate knew that they would go back to the emperor Tiberius at any time. And this seems to be what his primary concern was, more for his own position of authority. And so, therefore, in verse 8, when Pilate heard the statement, he was even more afraid. And when he entered into the praetorium again, he said to Jesus, where are you from? Isn't that the question? That's the question of all the Gospel of John. What is your origin? Where are you from? Many believed he was from the Nazarene, Nazareth. Those who knew who believed in him knew that he was from God? And that's the question that John brings to people's mind, and that those who recognize where he's from, then believe in him. But Jesus gave no answer. So Pilate said to him, "You do not speak to me. Do you not know that I have authority to release you, and I have authority to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no authority over me unless it had been given to you from above. For this reason, he who delivered me to you has the greater sin." I do want to mention just very briefly that any sin, no matter what it is, no matter how small it may appear, is a separation from God. In a legal sense, every sin, any sin, is a separation from God. But there are degrees of sin in which God is grieved. There are degrees in which God is grieved in the sense that some sins grieve him greater than. Just like a parent with a child would be grieved when a child does wrong. But some wrongs grieve you even more than others. There are degrees of sin. I'm going to finish up very quickly so that we can finish the crucifixion next week. 1 minute. As a result of this, Pilate made efforts to release him. Again, the Jews cried out, if you release this man, you're no friend of Caesar. Everyone who makes himself out to be a king opposes Caesar. And now this is what leads to Pilate, to, of course, to judge him. Therefore, when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down in the judgment seat. That's the place where he makes his final judgment. A place called the pavement in the Hebrew, the Gabbatha. But now in the day of preparation for the Passover, it's about the 6th hour. So 6 hours this has gone. He says to the Jews, "Behold your king." They cry out, "Away with him, away with him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" And the chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." How ironic it is that they reject the king and recognize who the true king is, who their king is. Satan, the world, Caesar. They have no king except Caesar. The question for you and I is, who's our king? Is it the world? Is it myself? Or is it the Son of God? Last verse. And so then he handed him over to be crucified. And the next time we meet, we'll look at the crucifixion.